So welcome everyone, welcome back. This hour and a half more or less will be devoted to a panel discussion on important issues that connect biodiversity to policy making. And we have a number of distinguished guests, as it is called. And I will introduce them to you first before we start the discussion. So sitting next to me is Fernando Rodriguez, University Professor of Applied Economics in Salamanca. I'm also going to ask everyone a personal question. So what is the thing that excites you most currently to introduce yourself? The others have more time to think about it, of course, so that's the disadvantage of sitting next to me. So what is your passion?
The questions ahead, and the way to, once you find the solutions. Before we were talking about the questions, the reality of the questions, and I always wonder, okay, we know the questions, in some cases we know the answers, but then the challenge is how to turn the answers into reality. So what we know in practical solutions.
Practical solutions, that's a good pointer, of course. Next to you is Professor Beierkuhnlein. Is that more or less correct? And for the remainder, I propose that I only use first names. That will make my life a lot easier, I can tell you. So, and also to make it a more informal meeting. Carl, Chair of Biogeography in Bayreuth. So what is your passion, Carl? No.
So I would like to make another point, and I think I got a lot of experience in different fields, but my passion is to sort of hopefully fascinate or make young people fascinated by the research questions that we are working on, and encouraging them to dare to go into this high complexity, also developing species knowledge, to investing time to develop in this field, to better understand what they're talking about, because they are needed. So I contributed in Bavaria also to many jobs for biodiversity, even at the scale of counties, but we don't have sufficient young people, and the ones that we have or that we get don't have all of them the training that you would need for these challenges. So I think the most important thing in the moment, of course, I'm very active in research, but the most important task for us in the moment is to encourage more young people to go into our direction.
Thank you. Good point, of course. So next to you is Professor Melis Petro. Is that correct? Pärtel, University of Tartu, Institute of Ecology and Earth Sciences. So your turn. What is your passion? Yeah.
I think I would say that I would like to understand a bit more biodiversity and ecological communities, ecosystems, and if I can share some experience and learn from others, then together we hopefully can make wiser decisions how to keep our planet. That's my passion.
Okay. Last is Juan Vergara, Professor of the University of Cadiz, Institute of Marine Research. Same question to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to be another part of marine sciences. Obviously, marine biodiversity is so important. We may think the planet is 3-4 parts of the planet is water. But sometimes we miss that. Our problems in the sea are quite different from the land. We may think that the sea is a matter of size. Obviously, we have kelp forests, seagrasses, we have manatees, but the important part of the sea is small. It's bacteria, it's phytoplankton, it's zooplankton, and it has an enormous effect on the trophic web. And when at the end we are worried by tuna, by fishes, by fisheries and things like that, but the major basis is this part. So we have a number of challenges, many of those related with technology. With observation technology, it's much more difficult to observe the sea than observe the land. and also about formation of people, experts that know the taxonomy of the organisms.
Okay, thank you. There's another invited speaker who unfortunately is not here yet. I'm not sure. Ron Dekker, from policy point of view. But we have a nice committee here that comes from science, but also from different fields of science. So what we will do is we have prepared a few key questions that we will try to pose to the panelists, and they have time to respond to that. If there is a discussion, they can react to each other. Also from the audience, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and someone will bring you a microphone, I think, so that we can pick that up. So that's the end. And at the end, we try to sort of make a summary statement from all the discussions that probably will also be posted on the LifeWatch website at some point. So that is the idea. So let's just start. So the first topic that is on the agenda, and this is Biodiversity Day, as you may know. So the first question is, what are the key scientific priorities to cope with the current threats and challenges to biodiversity and ecosystem conservation? What are the key questions from a scientific point of view? So maybe I can just start with Melis. What would be your first answer to that?
Well, there are evidently many unanswered questions, but starting with few aspects, I think one is actually microbial biodiversity, bacteria, microbial fungi who are living in soils and which depends on vegetation and which in the turn influence how different organisms can manage. We do not know much about wild microbes, how they live and what they're doing. They are widely involved in climate change, in carbon storage, soil health, and so on. And finally, even human health depends how much we are in contact with natural microbiota of soils and so on. So it's one point. I have several others, but maybe colleagues can add.
Thank you. That's a nice opener. So, from a terrestrial environment, for instance, Carl, what do you think are key questions scientifically that we have little information on?
Well, I think the greatest challenge for biodiversity research is to get a more closer link to the climate change, our community, and research questions. So our university, our study program is accepted by the United Nations as an observer organization. So we have been at COPs on climate change, nothing about biodiversity, on COPs about biodiversity, nothing about climate change, for many, many years now. The IPBS is much less perceived in the public than IPCC, for instance. And nevertheless, it has ecosystem services in its name, so it should be closer to the society than the IPCC. So I think it's really important to combine these two fields much stronger, not just for data, also for information, and first of all for knowledge. How biodiversity has feedback loops, and it's not climate, it's weather conditions, and how it can control and mitigate also what's going on. Because the public thinks extremes are increasing because we have a sequence of high pressure situations, and then we have a sequence of low pressure situations, and the deviation from average climatic conditions are increasing. But this means that we have a decrease in extremes because extremes is just defined by probability. And if you have a higher probability of drought, then statistically it's less extreme. But the effect in the ecosystem, of course, gets manifold then. So, and I think this is already rather complex for journalists, but it's really important to understand that while living on a continent in the northern hemisphere, where the northern ice cap is melting because it's sea ice, and energy gradients are decreasing, jet stream is slowing down, that it's a logic that we will have more and more years that are very dry and more years that are very moist in different places of Europe. And this will have so tremendous effects that you cannot express them by an average of 1.5 or whatever degrees. So we will experience 4 or 5 degrees of warming in our place when 1.5 degree is reached at the global scale. So, and then in addition, these extremes. And then biodiversity is just needed to be better understood how it reacts to these changes and how we may manage. And then if we just focus on biodiversity alone, I think it's not very promising. We need to link closer.
Okay, so from the marine environment, Juanjo, what would be the scientific challenge that you would put forward here? So,
as I say before, perhaps the emerging topics on the sea, some are shared with terrestrial part, but others not. For example, some emergent topics, you have increased temperature, and we also have marine heat waves on the sea. For example, we speak every time about the heat waves on land, but we are looking at the disappearance of corals, seagrasses in many places by marine heat waves. We have problems with ocean acidification. We have problems with every contamination we have in land at the end go to the sea. I mean, you have emergent contaminants, you have microplastics. We have a number of threats to marine biodiversity, and the challenging point is especially to be able to sample and to know all the marine biodiversity. Someone says that we know less of the deep sea than of the surface of Mars. So that's true. No, there is a lot of lack of knowledge in the sea. And it involves a lot of money from the point of view of the sampling, no? Ships, oceanographic cruises, and etc.
yes, it's unknown territory in many cases still. I think that is clear also in that case. Fernando, you come from a slightly different background. Are these also the scientific challenges that you're thinking of from your own discipline that needs to be studied in order to do something about the biodiversity crisis, or is it something completely different?
No, it's not different. So yes, let me start with a disclaimer. I'm an economist, so when in my ecosystem, when we have a look at problems, we usually try to focus on the first the cost for society, the cost, of course, of both sides, either distraction or protection, and then the decision-making of society, which of course is sensitive to some variables but not to others. For climate change, for instance, which I agree, we would need, of course, much more information about the relation between biodiversity and climate change, but it took some years for society to be aware of climate change and to start to be worried about climate change. The process with biodiversity could be similar, but so far we are not so aware of the consequences of losing biodiversity. So let me state it in a demand and supply framework. So I would say from the point of view of demand, we have today two sort of practitioners, agents that would be on that demand side. First, consumers and voters. In my opinion, the sensitivity to biodiversity is not so high for consumers and voters today. It's there, but it's kind of an abstract issue. For firms today, firms need some relation between their activities and biodiversity, but this is because of the fact that investors are today asking firms to be careful about biodiversity. And then we have supply. And on the supply side, we have a lot of information. This information is not always well related, so we have partial information in many ways. So it's like fragmented information. We don't have, I would say, still the whole picture for most biomes. But on the side of supply, that part of the demand, which is demanding information right now, which is firms and investors, so that they can they can state to the market that we are A or B or C, but especially we are A or A plus with our investments. The supply side of researchers have not been still too productive in producing what that supply side needs. This demand side. This demand side requires metrics, requires appreciation of values. This is what the market understands. The market is going very fast. So the market needs figures. It needs whether this is 1 million or 10 million. What are we talking about? And for this, the supply side has not been, it's not been fast enough. And of course, because this is not easy at all. I think it's the greatest challenge ever in environmental economics to put a value on biodiversity. So this is the match, I would say, we need the most.
Yeah, that indeed is a very different sort of approach. So we see also, and that's why it's nice that we have a diverse panel, that is the questions, how can we bring this together? And what is common to all of us, that we are looking for better solutions, but the way to get there, that is challenging. So if there is anyone from the audience, raise your hand if you want to ask a question regarding this first round. So don't be shy. There is time for that. We have plenty of time for questions as well. So what I observed from my own background is that if you look at the biodiversity world, it is split up in quite a few sections. So it's not only marine and terrestrial, but there's also the biodiversity worlds that focuses on counting how many species, is there enough alpha, beta, diversity, whatever major, or are iconic species present or not. So that's one group. There's another group of scientists that work on species interactions. They study, for instance, pollinators or the spread of diseases or any interactions between species that are relevant also for humans in many cases. And there's a third group of scientists that work on the cycles, and the cycles of nitrogen and carbon and water and everything else. Yeah? And that's another group. I don't think they meet. I don't think that they go to the same meetings. But nevertheless, you know that in all cases, it's the organisms that are underlying what is happening. It's like you said in the microbiomes. The microbiome determines a lot of the geochemical cycles, and interactions are important because it affects our diseases. So how can we bring those together from a scientific point of view? Carl, yeah.
Well, I'd like to answer that by asking everyone in the room, who is doing sports here? Well, I don't believe that nobody does sports. Come on. So just show your hands. Who is doing some kind of sport, however you call that? Can be checkers. Okay. So almost everybody does sports. Just a few years ago, we announced a professor position for sports ecology. Would you have applied for this position? Stupid if not. It's a department, a full professor position from the beginning for someone who is maybe 30 years old, and you would have missed the chance. So it came like in an economy study program, not in my faculty, in sports economy. So they train managers or so. So for Adidas or I don't know. They are extremely successful. And there, the students realized, so you need some knowledge about ecology if you're doing sports. So there's impact of many kinds of sports. If you want to apply for Olympic Games, you need some environmental assessment. So there's nothing about sports that is totally detached from ecology and biodiversity. So first, the students were in my lecture. Then they had more demand, so then a postdoc position was opened, it was filled. They had even more demand, and then they announced this position for a full professor position with a department, with postdocs and technicians for sports ecology, and we had almost no applications. Because the people from sports said ecology, so I'm not qualified. The people from ecology said sports, I'm not qualified for that. And it took us 2 rounds. Now we have a person, he's excellent, and he's doing very successfully, but I think we could also reverse the question and say, what does the society need from us? So which fields of society, and it's not just agriculture, it's not just forestry, it's not fishery, there's so many fields in the society that are linked with biodiversity. And maybe we should ask this question, not so much, I'm trained in mosses, so I'm interested in biologists only. So, yeah.
Yeah, so yesterday there was a demonstration of some sort in the city of Seville, and one of the statements was, the science is clear, we know what to do. Yeah? So that's a bit of a contradiction what we are discussing here, I think. So Melis, yeah, is the science clear? Do we know what we have to do?
Well, science is never ready, so it's a good news for young scientists, of course, but you have more always things to study. So I quite like this view that society needs values for biodiversity, and all biodiversity things scientists do are mostly case studies. They are context dependent, they are valid in some places, but I think that it's still possible to find some common ground. One is looking landscape scale habitat patterns like this digital twins. If you work in landscape scale, if you have habitats which can support biodiversity, then you can estimate quite much more easily how different landscape in different contexts are supporting biodiversity. And then you can same structure can support birds and microbes and plants. And if some economy or society decision can have healthy landscapes, it can make a big contribution to biodiversity conservation as well. But of course, it must be adjusted for different habitat types, different regions. But it's better than telling that I'm looking mosses only, or I'm looking only some bird species. If there are healthy landscapes, they can support various groups.
Okay, thank you, and that's also important. So what I get from this is sort of together is that in many cases it's the combination of functions. It's not only biodiversity that is relevant, but it is also climate change. And it's also the ecosystem services that are provided. And only if you try to make it a more complete system that we will be able to make progress. So setting one target is nice, but if it is at the cost of other targets, then you may question what does it mean. So, and that holds for many cases that have to do with this. Do we know enough already? Well, there is a limit to what we need to know, I guess that's also clear, but I think there is the fundamental understanding of how systems work is still important. Then maybe we can switch to, we already started to introduce the second topic, but that is related to what was already mentioned. So what is society expecting from us as a biodiversity ecosystem studying community? So what do they need? What do they want to hear? How can we convince them that some things are good but other things may be better? So that is the topic. Christos, maybe you can lead that discussion a bit further.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, it works. Let me stand a little bit because I need to stretch my legs, but also I need to address you, by looking at you directly, and I think that's even better. Well, the first thing is, one thing is what we have, right there as knowledge, as technology, and the other thing may be completely different, as Fernando said a minute ago, what the society expects from us. And that can go, like, for example, in the scientific knowledge development, that can go in the technological advancement that, for example, LifeWatch is involved very much in order to facilitate the researchers, the academicians to develop this knowledge and probably in which way all these things should be communicated in order to have a real impact and not just being, some kind of demonstrations in events, in the type of events like this, or in celebrations, of the parties of the gatherings of the societies, and so on. So let me start, from you, Melis. What do you think that the civil society is expecting from us when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystem knowledge?
I think that society is gradually more aware about biodiversity crisis and actually want to act something, want to do something. So what society asks us is some very site-specific questions. What should I do in my city, in my farm, around schoolyard, so on. So we need to think how we can deliver this ecological knowledge on biodiversity. We have studied mostly in nature reserves or something also in urban context, in very many different situations, and give at least the best simple advice, what can be done to keep biodiversity and also restore biodiversity. I think there is a demand for such knowledge, and it's a bit outside comfort zone of scientists, because we have not studied this schoolyard, but using some general knowledge we can give quite a good advice. We have tried it in Estonia to have such automated system to give advice what to do somewhere in any place in country, and it works quite well using just GIS layers. We know that more trees in city support biodiversity, less asphalt supports, and if you put things together, it can summarize quite easily in decent suggestions.
I gather that spins out, from the government level all the way to the citizens in a city or in a little village, anyway. Carl, what do you think that is expected from the community in terms of technological development when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystem research? I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about the community.
Scientific community.
The society.
The society.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. What do you mean? The society expects from the society? No. So,
No, from us.
From us. Okay.
From us.
Yeah.
The scientific and technological community.
Yeah. Surprisingly, not yet sufficiently nature-based solutions are asked for. Because still, the society has this naive perception that technical and expensive solutions are better, as long as we can afford to construct dams or whatever. It's much less costly to develop landscapes like sponges that keep the water back and recharge the aquifers for future freshwater supply. And we have the ecological knowledge to do so, but the society does not ask for that because they are still, somehow satisfied with technological solutions, and they enhance the gross product of the society because they are costly. And this discussion is not really made yet in the public. So I think this is a direction where we should go. Also, we should communicate that there are different scales. Of course, it's important to act at a global scale, but that's far from the people. They think. Is there someone, again, I ask the audience, so sorry to wake you up, is there someone who does not wear cotton in this room? Cotton? No, everybody. Yes, me too. Okay, we are all responsible for the extinction of species in the Aral Sea that doesn't exist anymore because of irrigation in the catchments. And, it's so far, we don't see it, that we kill the species there just by consuming cotton, just as one example. So there's so many examples that we are detached from our impact that we have on biodiversity in other places and contributing to, and everybody here with a certain right can say, I'm not guilty, I did not know about it. That's the global scale. And there we can create awareness and then maybe support the development of alternative products or more environmental friendly products. But I think even more important is the local and regional scale, as Melis also already mentioned, because that is where biodiversity loss translates into changes and loss of ecosystem functioning, translates into a loss of heterogeneity, translates in the end in a loss of ecosystem services to us. And there we also have the knowledge to manage ecosystems and communities towards a better functioning. But again, we are happy if, well, this grassland is mown 6 or 7 times and it's covered with liquid fertilizers, and because, well, the society does not see the disadvantage of that yet. It's a long-term disadvantage. The groundwater is polluted, carbon is released from the soil, and so, but all these costs are not translated into money yet. This is what future generations will feel, and I think it's our responsibility to highlight what's going on, because that's natural science, not yet translated into economy, but it has to be soon.
Thank you. Pretty comprehensive, and I think that what you touched is very important, because personally I think that the technological big projects, they're good projects. First, because they make a good impression to the society, and second, because there is a lot of opportunity for a lot of profit there, and maybe for the politicians it is being translated like a lot more jobs will be created, although somebody would challenge this view. Anyway, so that brings us naturally to the next issue, which is Juan. Do you think that what society is expecting from us is because we do not have something at the hands? For example, we do not have enough knowledge, or we do not have enough technological advancement to deal with their problems? Or is it because, for example, we need some specific ways by which we need to convey the messages from the science and technology to the community, to the society at large?
I don't think so. I think at least the marine scientific community has a lot of data, a lot of knowledge that can be translated. I guess right now the society can ask you for knowledge, and dissemination is so important to the society. But my question here is what is going to happen when we are going to start to have problems, real problems. I mean, increase of prices of food, depletion of fishes, is when the society is going to ask us for solutions, and perhaps it's going to be a bit late to give these answers. So I think that it is quite important to be ready for that, to be ready that at one point we are going to be on the focus of give solutions to big problems that perhaps are not, we are not going to be able to stop. I'm going to put just an example here related with climate change and also with global change. On the Strait of Gibraltar, we have an invasive species of seaweed, Rugulopteris. Nobody would care about that, except in that it causes a lot of problems about beaches in Tienderen, because you have a lot of cast of seaweed, and also for fisheries, because they destroy the fisheries, the nets of fisheries. So when you start to see, it's now it's on Canary Island, on Madeira, on Azores, on many places. And when you have this kind of problems and you identify the seaweed in a new place, you have all the social media following you, because it's a problem, and it's a problem that is affecting people.
Strange, but I had in my previous meeting actually to explain exactly how the workflows that we are developing can help actually for the early detection, and also the process of alerting the local authorities and make them, accountable for what's happening early on.
That's the worst thing, that when news people from journalists ask you and you say, well, you cannot do nothing now. You have to have early warning indicators, and you have monitoring systems to control the first stages of the invasion. then, they expect something more positive from your own, in your answer.
Yeah, but somehow, we always come with the impression that these things, like a monitoring system, they shouldn't cost anything. Although the dams, the big ones or the little ones or whatever else, technological interventions, they could cost, as much as we like, because, I don't know, there is a gap between these worlds. Fernando, what is your perception about, what kind of messages the community, the society out there expects from the scientific and engineering community to convey?
That's a very good question. So let me start by just reminding everybody that the IPBS is an intergovernment scientific platform. So it is meant to be some kind of platform united to words. And actually, I think it would be very difficult to say which of those species is more important. So let's have a look at the great success of the latest years. Okay, great success, which is fighting climate change, fighting CO2 emissions. Why is this a great success? Because in 3 decades, scientific community has been able to persuade society that we had a huge problem with CO2 emissions. But then we have one enemy, which is CO2 or greenhouse gases. We have one metric, which is tons of CO2 equivalent. And we have institutions which are interested in fighting CO2 emissions, which is mainly European Union, because it is aligned with some geostrategical reasons. So with biodiversity, we don't have that. First of all, we don't have one measure. We don't have one clear measure. When we talk about biodiversity, even from the science point of view, we don't have one measure for biodiversity. So we know what biodiversity is. We say, okay, this is wrong if we want to preserve biodiversity. But there's nothing like a measure of biodiversity. We could count the species, we could take into account resilience, we could take into account specificity. But when we talk to the society, it's very different to say measures of biodiversity instead of tons of CO2. Tons of CO2 is very clear. And then, since tons of CO2 is very clear, the political momentum with greenhouse gases has been reached, more or less easy, but it has been reached. With biodiversity, first of all, we don't have that metric, we don't have that political momentum. And my point of view as well is that this specific political momentum is much more difficult, I would say. So, well, in many countries, societies are polarized. And when you have polarized societies, it's very difficult to transmit a common message to the society. So once you send a message, maybe there is some other force that sends an opposite message just to harm you. So it doesn't matter about the reality of the message. So how deep have we gone in dealing with biodiversity, with interlinked systems? Well, mainly what we have advanced right now, what we have reached is the knowledge that there's much more than we don't know than that we know. So we know that the world is out there is very wide, very deep, and that should be enough to take precautionary measures, at least. So even though we don't have that metric, if we had the political momentum, I would say that at least we might have advances, even though we still don't know all the encyclopedia of biodiversity and how to protect it.
Yeah, I see Melis is nodding because he's talking, too much about the dark matter in biodiversity, and it's a huge question. That one, Melis, please.
Yeah. So on one point, we still need much more data on biodiversity, and it's extremely difficult to study. But now we have new technologies like environmental DNA, which can monitor standard way in different ecosystems. We have artificial intelligence, which can monitor images and sounds continuously in different places. So if we are able to monitor more, we might convince society much better with some examples, but there are still examples to have a single one measure on biodiversity. I can only imagine something ecosystem health or some general measure which is probably not ideal, but it can be uniform. It should work at the landscape scale, because it should depend on surrounding habitat patches, because you might have an ideal habitat patch in isolation and it doesn't work for biodiversity. You need connectivity, which also means that society need to accept spatial planning. If your neighbor has destroyed something, you need to protect more, because biodiversity acts in real landscapes. They do not look land ownership, but do not know who is the landowner. So something monitoring more and trying to synthesize something ecosystem health indices. Maybe one index might be the way to go.
Yeah, the thing what we're discussing is of course is fairly complex. That is part of the problem, and that's we don't have a single measure, and even if we could do it in euros, it would also be problematic, I think, in the end. The problem that I also see here is that the story towards citizens is not very convincing yet, and that is the problem. If we start to talk about gloom and doom, and you cannot eat meat, and you have to wear something else than cotton, and there's an entire list of things that are probably true, and there is value in it. But as a message to the audience, it's not going to help us a lot to improve things. So that is a bit of the challenge. And for me, I am going to say something that is entirely unscientific, I guess. So sometimes I say, we know that the system is very complex, that we don't have single measures and we don't know everything. But sometimes we just have to pretend. We just have to pretend that it's easy, that we can make the right solutions, and that we can make better solutions than we have now, rather than always emphasize all the things that you don't know and how difficult it is, and that you shouldn't wear cotton anymore, etc. So the example of this morning, that it is possible to predict the flows of birds in the air so that you can reduce the impact on wind parks, is an example of a small example for sure, but it's an example that with knowledge we can make things better. So is there a way to start thinking about our way to communicate this in other terms than gloom and doom? So Carl, you were anxious to answer. So.
Well, I think this community is quite selected. Nevertheless, it's not uniform, and the society also is not uniform. So there are different groups, different interests in the society, and different languages also that they speak and that they want to communicate. So, and part of the community is interested in money, of course, right? And if you're able to illustrate that a nature-based solution is cheaper for the taxpayers, I think that's an argument. Why not? Another community is interested in the future and climate change mitigation, maybe. And if you can explain that you can sequester carbon in a grassland just by management, and that our society not necessarily has to export pigs to China, so why not doing something for our environment and for our climate? And we can do it, and we know how to do it. We just have to change the subsidies for agriculture and have a pressure on policy. And of course, there is also a group that has an intrinsic motivation, that is happy about butterflies, and I am as well. And of course, this also has to be respected, so the feelings of the people. So you cannot just come up with monetary and technological approaches, because that would not be justified in the case of biodiversity. You also have to see that. And then, of course, the way, so first there are different audiences, not one audience. And we would need maybe some sort of regional LifeWatch or regional IPBS, local ones that would translate knowledge for these groups and for this group in a different way, and well, be more professional in communication. So I'm communicating in the moment mostly with ministries and ministers and consulting, so not paid for, but you know, like you do in East Crimea, and I do that since more than 20 years with different ministers. And sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. So it's a question of the personality and not of the political party, it's my experience. And there's these biodiversity councils that are now discussed in Germany. Until now, it's just in Bavaria. It's also discussed now at the national scale. But I think it's more important at the local and regional scale even, to reach the people. And then, well, the question of language, of course, this cannot be done in English. Must be done also in dialect. So I was working as a freelancer until I was 35. And the biggest success that I had was with an old lady that I had to convince her that, well, her piece of land, like 3 hectares, will be bought by money for compensation for another impact. And well, she always had her neighbor there. And I was successful because I spoke her dialect. If I would have spoken regular German, she wouldn't have listened to me. And then in the end, my success was that she said, they were both 75, she said to her neighbor when she learned that she will get 25,000 Deutschmarks, let's go to Paris. And so, but I would not have had this nice story about the old ladies if I would have not spoken their language. And if you speak to, well, leaders in economy, you need another language. And if you speak to politicians, you need another language. But we are not professionals in different languages. We need someone who translates this into these communities.
Before we go to the next one, I suggest we should turn to our audience here and try to pick up questions. I feel that the atmosphere is warming up, and it might be, several people not looking at their emails, and they would be, more active in this discussion. Any question from the audience, please? Over there. Thank you. Name and affiliation, please.
Yeah, Simone Santoro, Universidad de Huelva. Question, you're speaking about language, different language. You need to speak the same language when you speak with politicians, for example. Now we are in the big data era, but data must be analyzed. You need people to build models and to be able to validate them, to interpret them. I'm wondering if you think that the academic world is preparing the right skills we need in the future to do this job. Do you think the university are preparing people with the right expertise we need to do this job, to do this task?
No.
So I would say who is prepared. Then it has come to my mind, a friend of mine, probably you know him, Fernando Rodriguez. He's a scientific, he's very active, and I think 2 or 3, or maybe 1 month ago, he was on TV speaking about climate change. And then at the end of the interview, he said that he felt himself as if he was a decorative scientist, a flower-based scientist, because he was with some politicians and some other members of the civil society, and then the TV interviewer said, "Okay, that's all for today." He said, "Oh, so that's all? So we came here, we told you the problems that we have ahead, and you say that's all? Then what is our role here? Just to be here as decorative people?" So I would say, does the university prepare? Probably not. I mean, you need your own way, and then once you are there, what is the rest of the society doing with your knowledge? It's a good question as well.
Yeah, Melis.
I think education is extremely important. For some reason, it seems that very simple ecological knowledge we have gathered over the last 100 years is not understood outside biology field, in economy or in political science. So some basic ecology courses should be somehow be in university in each single university curricula, but we have tried to tell about that, but haven't been successful yet. So it's one way that people think about biodiversity, ecology, nature, whatever fields they are, because we cannot live without in the future. It's actually future education should include ecology.
Any other question from the audience, please? To Christina?
Cristina Huertas from LifeWatch. You have mentioned that we need a metric in order to raise the awareness of the society on biodiversity. And this is very important to link the science of psychology with the rest of the disciplines of biodiversity. Who do you think should lead the process to find this metric?
Go on, Fernando.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm optimistic, always. Maybe that's a problem. But I would say IPBS, if you have followed the story of IPBS, when it was created, you know, it says B is for biodiversity, E is ecosystem services. So the idea was to create some sort of common standard to evaluate biodiversity and ecosystem services, so to create some metrics. Not a problem. The issue is that IPBS is United Nations, so it's not just technical. So after some years, they discovered themselves that they were more comfortable with another concept. Instead of ecosystem services, nature contributions, NCP, nature contributions to people, NCP. And that kind of moved their path towards a more probably comprehensive approach and more qualitative approach instead of putting a value. But now United Nations, using a technical way, 2 years ago, they transformed the SIA experimental ecosystem accounting into just SIA ecosystem accounting. So we are starting a new way to obtain some metrics about the evaluation of ecosystem services and natural capital. I'm optimistic with that. So far, the only part that has passed to the statistical process is the biophysical part, not the economic part. But the economic part is already there. So for those who have the high beams on, we can see what will come next. Can we be just confident that this will solve all the problems? I'm completely sure that we can't. So not for all the problems, but it will be, I think, a great step forward in order to measure also what Carl has been mentioning. If we put a value on what the nature is providing us with, it will be more easy for the society to take a position to defend nature. Of course, if society doesn't want to protect nature, we're not going to do it, but it will be easier to take that political position, which, in my opinion, is the definite step forward. Okay.
Should we move to the next one, or should we?
Well, maybe a slow transition is possible, I think. So what I was wondering about too is that on the one hand, we say, well, we have to have perhaps different messages depending on the audience, what Carl is presenting, also speaking the language. But I couldn't help of thinking also of Trump politics in a sense. What Trump was successfully doing is he goes to a group and he tells them what they want to hear. Yeah? He goes to the Christian parts and he tells them about abortion. He goes to the Cubans and he tells them about communism. And so he gathers all kinds of opinions by telling different stories. And so there is a danger of doing that also in this sense. You cannot satisfy everyone. And so that is, I think, sometimes a problem. But I'm also was thinking about inspiration from biology. So we were also trained in biology and looking at symbiosis and how wonderful symbiosis was. But in reality, symbiosis is in most cases a very tight connections that the one cannot live without the other anymore. So, and the reason for that is that if you lose that connection, you open opportunity for free riders, for people that try to avoid the system and profit without paying. So that's also in an economic sort of way of thinking is for me also the question, can you think of incentives or models in which really we don't have polarized situations that each have their own interests, but rather that you have sort of making sure that it's also in the interests of farmers to preserve biodiversity, for instance. It's also in the interest of citizens to allow the presence of a bear or a wolf or whatever, even in their backyard, which is, these are very complicated issues, of course, but if we cannot create a connection that these things are connected at the level of individuals or societies or groups, you will never get rid of the system that you have a polarized system, which is very difficult to operate, and then you depend on politics. So it's a bit philosophical maybe, but maybe some of you all can react.
Well, I think this touches also what was happened in the change of the name of the IPBS, which was in the beginning just an intergovernmental panel of experts. Now it's changed into intergovernmental platform, science policy platform. So there's a dialogue included in the name. And Trump did the dialogue sort of in a manipulative way, as you illustrated. But if we do it in an open way, that we would say, well, we scientists, we should not tell the society what they need. But the society should also not just decide what they need about biodiversity, because maybe they don't know enough about the functioning of ecosystems and how, well, and there is a symbiosis between mankind and biodiversity at the large scale. So we cannot live without biodiversity. And in many cases, biodiversity is created and managed and manipulated also by us in land use also. So there is this tight connection at the global scale. And I think in the local and regional scale, so when we would accept as scientists that we should get into a dialogue with the society, and then from this dialogue where both parts are involved, well, this is communicated then to the public. Not the biologist says the journalists what to do about biodiversity, but also not the economist alone. But if both together form such a local IPBS and then communicate, well, we have experts from many fields, from sociology, from, well, industry, whatever, from land use. And we also have these biologists and we understand how we benefit both sides. I think this is promising because this can be taken up then and it will be accepted in the communication because it's not the expert dictator who says what to do.
Melis, before I give you the floor, I just need to remind you that we tried and we still are on this path to find out metrics for biodiversity. We ended up with those essential biodiversity variables, and the way that they're being developed, actually they reflect the complexity of the scales of observation and also the many levels of organization. And therefore, that's a very difficult function to solve. But okay, Melis.
I think a lot of the conflict between society and mostly economy and biodiversity conservation depends how long perspective we look, because in long run, having a sustainable economy which keeps biodiversity, it should be economically beneficial in long run, but most decisions are made for 5-10 years perspective. If you can somehow convince decision makers that making planning and action in sustainable way is actually beneficial for your retirement age or your children, then we might be more successful. But then we need to explain ecological principles, why it is so. Now they do not believe, or they do not think.
One last chance to have any question from the audience.
Christos, I just want to add a question about the communication and all that stuff. It's quite important project to have today. I'm sorry, economy, sociologists, but it's quite important to have experts of communication, because sometimes scientists, we are so complicated to explain the things and we don't reach people. So it's important to reach the people. You can learn during a time a lot about that.
One last question from Aitana.
Thank you. I'm Aitana from LifeWatch Eric as well. I think what you just said is very important. We're talking here about communication, and I think there is a big disconnection between scientists and society. So it's really hard to ask what society needs, because probably they don't really need what they need. They don't really know what they need. And I think it's also very important to associate biodiversity and nature with emotions, because people, don't forget, we respond through emotions. So if we don't make that link and we only give facts, society is not going to respond. And we're also going to find a new, bigger problem, which is the newer generations that are completely disconnected from nature, biodiversity, because they are living in a world that we are not used to. So I think we have to start thinking also about how the newer generations think, feel, and relate, and the relationship between the people and the nature. Thank you.
Any reaction from the panel? Yes, Melis, and then on to the next question.
Yeah, well, it is extremely important to reconnect or strengthen connection with nature, and for young people, we can tell that there are many apps which can identify plants and birdsong quite efficiently. So maybe they can use a favorite medium, cell phone, and actually step out to nature a bit. But yeah, it's hard, but it's something we need to do.
Peter.
Yes, a final topic, although we have touched upon it already, is how can we have more influence on political systems on change and have a profitable impact on change, both by communication as well as at the political level. And what is then the role of Eric? What is the role of LifeWatch? What is our role as scientists in trying to push it in a better direction? So the first question maybe is well, what is our common message? So what is our common message that we can tell again and again to politicians and be consistent to that? Or is it, maybe that's what Carl said, well, we should really think about that is possible. We should have a variety of messages, and depending on who is listening, tell them what is relevant for them. So is there a common message, or is it spread out over many different things? Who would like to comment on that? Yeah.
So I think one way is to share knowledge, which messages work, which not, because we need to experiment. We do not know yet, but some stories goes well, and how they are told, how to reach out and being united in this network. We can learn from each other how to reach better to the society.
So is it allowed to make mistakes in that case then too? Yeah.
Okay, from the natural science perspective, the message that we need to communicate to policymakers is that the people that are electing them are not that stupid. So they know and learn a lot about what's going on this planet, and particularly the younger generation. And these are the people that will decide whether they will be re-elected. So in Bavaria, there we have still a prime minister who is conservative, and we had an initiative for plebiscite to preserve biodiversity like a few years ago. And in the beginning, this prime minister was totally in opposition to that, saying, well, this will be the end of the world and agriculture and anything. And he was really like totally confrontative to this initiative. And then there were two stages. So one, you had to pass 10% of the electing community to sign in, and then it would go to a decision, to a law. And this first step was signed by 18.5% of the elective population. Then the prime minister said, oops, I'm gonna lose. And he had a few options. One was still continue fighting against it and hoping that he will succeed, but that was extremely unlikely. The other alternative was to have this then for decision and an alternative law from the government that you can call the better biodiversity law or something like this, and you put this first and the other one second, which is more complicated, and then you hope that you would win. But the Minister for Environment who had prepared that was from another party, so he would not win either. So what he did is from one day to the other, he said, oh, now I'll be in front of this movement, I make it to a law right away next week in the parliament, and he accepted it. Because he realized that he would lose. So I think, well, this is such a strong influence, and policymakers don't think ahead and make decisions for the future, they react to the society. And the society is not stupid.
I would say that the common message to everyone would be biodiversity pays. Mm-hmm. So protect biodiversity, it will pay back. There's a problem, as you know, related to to the fact that we don't want to pay as individuals for what we get as society, so that the free rider problem, no, in economics. So we tend to think that someone else will pay, and biodiversity is a common good. So this happens, of course. We believe that someone else will take care of it, and we will benefit from it anyway. So we have to tell the people that biodiversity pays, that sooner or later they will get rewarded, and that now it's logical to let's say, devote resources to this issue, because it will pay back very soon. We don't have to wait until the next generation. So many countries in the world are living on biodiversity. And we know that future tourism will be ecological tourism, or it will not be. So as we have taken some positions in the past related to the environment and related, for instance, to the emissions of CO2, we need to tell that message to society, and in my opinion, we need to help politicians to create that message, because that message today is polarized. So you have one part of the political spectrum defending this sort of messages, and in some cases, I listen to some politicians from some other part of the spectrum saying, how can I persuade my voters that this is a good measure? It's impossible. And I say, no, it's not impossible at all. It will pay, but you have to believe it. How can you believe it? Showing that employments will be created, that of course society will change, but this is not bad because you're getting a better position for the future. Giving information about the value of ecosystem services, giving information about what we lose when there's fire, for instance, a giant fire, saying this is what we are losing. Why? Because we have not protected nature enough. So that sort of message, we should also help politicians to tell the people.
Yeah. Thank you. So biodiversity pays. Does it also hold for the marine environment? Biodiversity in the marine environment pays as well? Yeah. Put on the microphone, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I completely agree with my colleagues about all the arguments that they have been saying. It's no difference. I mean, in the sense of what society is expecting for us and what we should give to the society and to the politics and to all the people around.
Yeah. So in the marine environment, for instance, I think that what is in the end perhaps surprising is that even biologically fairly simple cases like over-exploitations of fish stock, which is bad economically, is bad for biodiversity, is so difficult to solve, although it's evident that over-exploitation is not good for anything. It's,
perhaps the topics change among terrestrial and marine parts, but the bottom message is the same. That's what I mean.
And the same for the use of reefs and the relation to recreation, and so the value is enormous. Biodiversity pays for sure.
Yeah,
but still,
I think we have to sell the idea that biodiversity is all the ecosystems has functional services, and as my colleagues say, they have natural capital values. Of all these ecosystems are so important. For example, I work with seagrasses, and for example, in dissemination with kids in schools, with whatever, even with politicians. I mean, double way is so important, the function and services of seagrass meadows, but also we have developed here in Andalusia the first standard of blue carbon sequestration, and it's one of the first standards in Europe. Speaking about carbon mitigation, CO2 mitigation. So, I mean, you had to find a way to translate it to different levels.
Well, translating into different levels also needs to realize that we have no longer just research and teaching, but there is also a third mission into the society. So my wife is also a professor, and as she has kids, or we have kids, well, she also does a lot with school children of different ages and going to the Alps to melting glaciers and so on. And that has a strong impact on this generation. Or we cooperate with artists in a conference that we had 2 weeks ago, an artist who illustrates the human footprint in different places of the world in pieces of art. And that, you reach different kind of people there. Papers and publications and talks and, panels is nice, but we have to realize that we have a responsibility beyond every one of us.
And younger people are important, of course, and it's like what maybe from the audience that was asked is they're not only gaming and living in a digital world, but they're also very concerned about the future, of course, and that is another aspect of that is probably going to be important. So I was also wondering, there is this, I forgot the name, but this is example of a situation where you can create dependencies on purpose. So you have a situation with a piece of land upstream gets water, a piece of land downstream gets drought. So, and these are different owners, so immediately you have a conflict. So the solution proposed was, well, give a piece of land upstream and a piece of land downstream. So they have an interest in both production. So that's a smart idea. But I was also wondering, you say, well, biodiversity pays, but it still takes time, and it's not for everyone. And it's a tragedy of the common good that is still lurking behind that problem, of course. So maybe there are smarter ways from an economic perspective to make sure that these things are connected, that you immediately feel the benefit of supporting something rather than having to wait years or whatever. So, and it's not going to work for everyone, but you can think of company policies or incentives to companies or incentives even to citizens to make sure that the value of biodiversity is of part of the package that they are receiving immediately. So are there ideas about economic incentives in that sense?
Yes, there are. And actually, the fact that we have a European Union taxonomy for sustainable projects and sustainable investments is about that. So more and more projects are selling themselves as sustainable or funded by green bonds. And then not only the European Union, also United States, China, Australia, even some smaller countries like Colombia, they have created, and we have created our own taxonomy saying, okay, if you want to say that such or such investment is sustainable, you have to fulfill with these 6 commitments. One of them, as we know, number 6, is about biodiversity. Okay, but the respect of these principles, of these pillars, is due to the fact that the financial sector is already working on selling some sorts of products, financial products, stating that they are green. So that could be false publicity of the features of your project. So that's one of the cases in which we need to regulate information. But why? Because the public is worried about this. But the strength of this movement, I think it's much less powerful than the strength of more, let's say, conscious, wider movement, also in my opinion, that should take place from the political point of view, which is not only biodiversity pays because it is this is what scientists say, and they are in a black box and we cannot enter there, but because we provide with information again to the public and to the to politicians to help them sell this message. You were talking before about fishermen and overexploitation, and of course, once you have a common good, even if you have a deal about how to exploit it, it's in the benefit of each of the fishermen individually to overexploit it. That's the tragedy of the commons. That's why you need either regulation or a common rule for the exploitation of the common good. As you know, we have the tragedy of the commons, George Harding in the 60s, and then we have Elinor Ostrom, the rules so that the common good survive. But for that rules to be followed, the conditions, I think we should be too optimistic to trust on those conditions for those rules to work in all sectors in which we need to work to protect biodiversity. We need more.
Okay, I think it's good to wrap up. So I will not end with a summary or something. It is clear that one size fits all will not work. I think we need an approach that will be different, that we have to approach different groups, make convincing stories that we can, with our knowledge, can really help to design better measures at a local scale, at a spatial scale, at a world scale. We haven't discussed the world scale as much, of course, because the situation we have here are different from the ones in the global south. That's also something that is important. The scaling is very important, and maybe also last but not least, that the future is also in the hands of the younger people. So some way or another we have to involve them and make sure that we convince them. And the people sitting here are not a very diverse group, as if I may say so. So we have to make sure that the diversity in the people that also help to tell the story is good, and that we need all forces to make this happen. So with that, I would like to end, and I would like to give an applause to all the panel members for their contributions, and hopefully you found it interesting enough to think about and also to discuss this further with them, or with me, or with Christos, with LifeWatch people, to see how we can make progress in what we try to achieve. So thank you all. Yeah.